Thank you for inviting me. The topic I was given was in terms of the United States and beyond. However, it amounts to the same thing. So I'll begin with the United States, but since it's supposed to be more than that, I think what I'll do is discuss the United States and consequently what is likely to happen and the debates that are going on and where it's going to go. Then in relation to other crucial countries like China, the EU, etc. And I assume it's 45 minutes. So I'll begin then with the United States. Well, I have in fact given similar talks over the last month or so, which boiled down to a discussion of where is the United States going. I don't think many people expected the United States to take this particular form. That's to say, to have a democratic president elected who then began to talk about reversing policy back to the period before 1980. And they have talked precisely in those terms, which from their point of view makes sense. From our point of view too, it's all, we too will have to look at it in terms of the capitalist class deciding to take a less concessive policy as from 1980 with Thatcher and Reagan. So basically any discussion of the present has to be in these terms of a reversal of the failure of the period from 1980 to the present, the Reagan, Thatcher reversal of capitalist policy. That's to say, the policy after the war, immediately after the war, was of a limited concessions. In Britain, it meant full employment, and not just in Britain. It didn't mean full employment in the United States, but it was certainly fuller employment than what has come into existence. What is clear is that since 2008 down to the present, the world has been stagnating. Let's say the capitalist economy, which governs the world, has been stagnating. Now, the way it's normally put is in terms of a great recession. That's to say, it's not a depression. It's not like the great period before 1939-40. It's somewhat less than that. That's the way it's put. But it seems to me that's just a nonsense. You can, of course, define depression and recession any way you like. And that's really what's been done. When you have stagnation, which is what we've had in the world economy, from really it's 2007 and even 2006, because the downturn de facto happened in the United States, the beginnings of it in 2006 even. However, it showed itself in its crassest form, in which the whole system was threatened, which they're now admitting, or they have been admitting, from 2008 onwards. What's of course interesting is that from 2008, you've had relative stagnation throughout the period. There's been slight ups and downs, and the term used usually is crisis. But if you have a crisis for whatever number of years you want, 12 years, it stops being a crisis. You have to use some other new name for it. We understand, if you look at Marxism, we have a particular view of crisis, usually in terms of going up and down. But here you have just down. It's a very low rate of growth if there is growth. And it depends on the country whether they have any growth at all. Britain's growth has been low. In the third world, it's been particularly in trouble. In South Africa, it didn't have any growth in the last few years. And I think that's probably an optimistic estimate of the situation in South Africa. And of course, what on earth do we mean by growth anyway? So what we have in this period down to the present has been an overall downturn which the capitalist class wasn't able to change. Now, its major form, which most people seem to avoid somehow, I don't know why, is the fact that the capitalist class isn't investing, or it's investing in a routine way. And the result of doing that, because I'm describing the United States now, the result of doing that, of course, is that growth is low, obviously, but it means the rise in productivity is next to zero. In the United States, it's below 1%. So there's no question about the problems involved. Clearly, the capitalist class doesn't want to invest, but doesn't see any great need to invest. Now, when I say it doesn't want to invest, doesn't mean there's no investment whatsoever, as it were. But there's no added investment compared to the previous years. Even if the profit rate would allow it, it isn't done. And the usual example I give of representing some of this stuff is that if you look at the Bank of New York Mellon, it actually takes in $41 trillion for non-investment, if you can imagine that. That's to say, it takes it in as custodians. The GDP of the United States is roughly a bit over 20 trillion. Now, of course, it doesn't compare with any other country. It doesn't compare with Britain, which is far somewhere else in terms of these figures. So you have 41 trillion, which has basically been just put in some odd place, or it's go for some sort of routine investment. That's what it boils down to. That's a lower rate of investment that in principle they could get if they were to go and decide to build some new firm structure or whatever. So that's the state of the United States at one level, that it's not expanding in that way. And of course, it does mean, which is the implication, that the standard of living of the majority of the population has, to put it nicely, is not rising. But in fact, for many people, it's falling. And it's quite clear that the farmers in particular are in trouble. And it's not surprising there's parties which are not really proposing any way out, let's say, until Biden came, that they would then look for any kind of figure. And they did, they found Trump. So one's not talking of a highly successful economy in the United States. You're talking of an economy which basically can continue, but is still within what amounts to a form of its own economic lockdown. So that's the condition where a substantial part of the population has had a declining standard of living, where a substantial part of the intelligentsia, or young people in particular, are critical of the system. And that's true, of course, as we know of Britain too. If you look at the statistics in Britain show that people between 18 and 39 vote left. The majority vote left. So the United States is not any different in that respect. It's not surprising that students vote for the left. That is the real situation. And now, of course, in principle, you'd expect the ruling class to be trying to find a way out of this. 41 trillion, which is only obviously a proportion of their holdings, doing next to nothing, obviously isn't the solution. They obviously not threatened. The average income of the highest sector in wealth terms in the United States is clearly in billions. The Forbes estimated there was something like 600, 700 people whose incomes are in billions. That's not true of Britain, of course. I think the numbers in the highest bracket getting a good few thousand million would be quite smaller than that. Anyway, the very highest layer in Britain, I think you're talking of considerably lower incomes, is something like 10 to 15,000. I've worked on the income tax statistics of Britain. Anyway, the point is that Britain's had its own crisis, it's in its own crisis. In the United States, the way out which a section of the ruling class appears to have taken is precisely to support Biden. The obvious example is to look at, say, Jamie Dimon, the director of J.P. Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the United States, one of the biggest, if not the biggest in the world, supports Biden. Very unusual to get. Top banker supporting the left. And obviously Biden isn't left-wing in this sense. I don't think we should regard him as that. But his movement is back to what were the slogans of old social democracy. He's calling for the resuscitation of trade unions. And you can go on in terms of the quoting him if you want, in which you can see that he's standing for what amounts to old time. I say old time, it's not really old time. This old time would be in period before 1914, but the post-war says social democracy. So we're talking now, just now, right now, of a budget being introduced in the United States to Congress, in which Biden is proposing expenditure of something like over $6 trillion. Now, that's only just come out, but it's substantially more than the 4 trillion or so that would have been expected. And he's proposing a series of measures which will help young children onwards. A series of what amounts to social democratic measures. And they were proposed before, and he's carrying them out. The budget deficit is projected to hit about 15% of GDP this year. And the Financial Times says this is a gap historically associated with wartime. He's also going to produce a bill, he's producing a bill, an infrastructure bill, which he will be unveiling in Pittsburgh. That will cost more than 3 trillion over 10 years. And of course, the question is, how is this going to be accepted? In fact, he's introducing all the various measures that a Social Democrat would introduce. The Financial Times actually points out that the Internal Revenue Service has shrunk by more than a fifth over the past decade and increasingly avoids auditing the very wealthy. Curious capitalism in which it tries its best to do nothing for the majority and protects the rich. So what Biden is proposing is precisely to tax the rich. It's not something that many people would have expected before, that he would have taken this measure and the rich would have accepted it, because a substantial section of the rich have accepted it. That's why I quoted Jamie Dimon. He's the banker, of course, but a banker to the rich. It's pointed out that roughly 70 billion a year goes uncollected due to various offshore accounting schemes. I'm just quoting that to indicate what Biden is attacking and what he's trying to change. So you're talking of a deliberate intention to raise the level of taxation in order to pay for this budget, which does amount to helping the majority of the population, as opposed to simply helping the rich, which is what happened under Trump. I, of course, could go into detail in the various forms of this. Biden is proposing stronger trade union rights, increased tax credits for the low pay, a higher minimum wage, the creation of lower skilled jobs to improve infrastructure and fight climate change. And higher taxes will actually deal with it. One can go into enormous amount of detail, but it's not necessary. It's clear. You actually have a government which will tax the rich in order to help the poor. That's the kind of immediate form that one sees. But at the same time, Biden wants to get the support of more of the rich. He doesn't want to have to go in for a civil war, a direct civil war. And of course, in the Senate, he doesn't have a majority, except insofar as the vice president, who's the chairman of the Senate, votes for the Democrats, which of course she would. But there'll be the odd Democratic senator who, of course, may not follow the line. So their majority isn't that clear. They have a majority in the lower house, as opposed to the Senate, of which I was talking, but it's quite small. So what Biden is trying to do is to go slowly in order to get. Okay, I've spoken, I suppose, for about 20 minutes on this. That's very generally, this is very general. If I can ask any questions any more. I can either give you the detail or look up the detail and give it to you. Well, the question, of course, is whether Biden will be able to get it through over time, whether he has the majority of the population, whether Trump will not get sufficient support to win a new election. But the way it looks, it seems to me, is that the population is much more in Biden's favor than not. After all, it would make far more sense. He's in favor of going back to Obama's attempt to provide free health. He's in favor, as quoted, in terms of the minimum wage, which he tried to get through. He's just tried to get through in one way or another. Some form of it is going to emerge or has emerged, but he couldn't actually get it through as a law. It's very odd, actually, that it couldn't. $15 after all, which is about 11 pounds, isn't a tremendous burden on the capitalist class. It's amazing that the minimum wage up to now has been $7 an hour. However, it just indicates the problems that he actually has. Quite obviously, a substantial section of the ruling class is opposing him, even though probably a substantial or majority section is supporting him. Now, that would tend to be the case. Why, if you are already a billionaire, why do you want to punish the rest of the population? Why wouldn't you not want a more stable country? Because it's clear, given the number of riots, the constant use of the police, and the extreme ideologies that the police actually have, that the United States would be a much better place, even for the rich to live in, if they did make these reforms. And after all, during the period down to 1980, the rate of profit wasn't that low. Most of the time, it was somewhere around 9%. In Britain, of course, that's quite different. It was down to, in 1979, it was down to 1%, if that. But that wasn't true of the United States in that way. So, in other words, from the point of view of one section of the capitalist class, you could see that they would be prepared to concede. And of course, under conditions where, in fact, an increasing layer of the population, or increasing numbers of the population, are supporting greater equality in society, you'd expect that, given that there is no other threat, there is no Soviet Union, which is supposed to be left-wing and a danger, there's no external danger really threatening the United States. The one danger which, of course, threatens them, as everybody else, is climate change, and that, of course, Biden is actually taking up. Having said that, what Biden also wants to do is go slowly to get support. It's not at all clear that he will get that support. I don't know how far it will actually go, but it seems to me very likely that it will go sufficiently far to cause change. It's also quite likely to inspire an increasing section of the population. It's rather odd at this time that we see the United States, which has been being regarded as the bastion of the right, if not the far right, to actually see a left forming there, and incipient left, really. And so there are various groups, but they're obviously not going very far. I think, what is it, about 100,000 people belong to the left group in the Democratic Party. But In fact, there isn't a minister in Biden's cabinet who's left wing. Sanders is in the Senate, and he's got a leading role in the Senate, but he's not a minister. So one can, as it were, be too optimistic about what's happening in the United States as well. However, it does seem to me that there really isn't much choice for the United States as to what, or individuals and the ruling class. The right itself it would appear in supporting Trump to have very substantial numbers on its side. If they were to take power, in the end, the ruling class will have lost. What they will have done to the country by the time they leave it wouldn't bear thinking of. It would inevitably mean that a left would form under pressure. It may take, I don't know, may take a short amount of time, may take a very long time, but it would happen. It would be utterly stupid for them to go for what amounts to a dictatorial form. I think they realize that, and they are prepared to make the obvious concession, which they are now doing. They're not moving to socialism. It amounts to a limited form of concession, and you can call it social democracy. But it does mean a rising standard of living, and hence a budget, a radical budget, an improvement in schools, and an improvement for helping the old, etc., etc., and improving the situation of the unemployed. When indeed Biden has even called for full employment. Well, now that's the situation in the United States. The United States is the controlling power throughout the world. It is the globalist power, regards itself as such. Trump directly attacked that concept of being the global power, which meant that the United States could do what it liked, as it were, wherever it liked, without trying to build some kind of interaction with other countries. It would order the other country to do what was required. It would act in its own interest, as Trump made very clear. Except its own interest cannot be formed really without looking at the world as a whole and where the United States in it, and how best for the United States to fit in it, so that in the end it will be the individuals will be far better off. That long-term viewpoint, of course, isn't Trump's viewpoint, but it would be the kind of viewpoint that any rational person would take. Of course, if you're talking of capitalism, capitalism is not capital is not here to help someone who isn't part of that capital. Nonetheless, the United States has established itself before Trump as the international power, the global hegemon, and continues to do so. And you can see how Biden has been interacting with the other leaders of the world. He is about to meet Putin, and there's articles as to why on earth he's going to meet Putin. An article I was reading in the Financial Times, which was attacking him for wanting to meet Putin. Well, that'd be a whole other discussion. But the reason he's meeting Putin isn't because he likes Putin, because he actually called him a killer. It's because the United States is the global power, and he wants to maintain that global power. Finance capital is necessarily international, but it's not international in the sense of dividing the wealth evenly or helping the world. It's international in the sense of maintaining a world in which the United States can grow. And in that sense, it does require other countries not to go into a permanent slump, because then they're completely useless. But actually have the world with which the United States is interacting, to have it developing. Of course, what it wants is the United States to be in overall control, and the dividends to flow to the United States. That makes sense. Obviously, they won't get any dividends if they're not in control in the way that they are in control. In fact, we know there are very large flows of dividends going into the United States, very important. The United States runs, of course, we know, a monthly deficit for the rest of the world of 50 to 60 billion. 50, 60 billion. So nonetheless, you have the upper middle class, sections of the middle class in various countries send their wealth to the United States in order to be preserved or actually developed. The United States plays a critical role, in fact, in terms of the overall development of economies and of companies. And that includes China. China, not that I'm an expert in China, but we can see, and an article did appear some months ago, pointing out that something like 60 to 80% of enterprise, of industry, that's outside the farming area, is under private enterprise. Whereas the left was able to talk of China as state capitalist, or section of the left called it state capitalist. Now, in fact, the right calls it state capitalist. It's a standard term in relation to the United States, to China. And there's no question of its actual development. Whereas the development after they did the deal in 2002 with the World Trade Organization, which opened things up, China has developed phenomenally. In the early period, 15% a year. At the moment, it, although obviously it was held back by the spreading of the coronavirus, by the pandemic, using what amounts to Stalinist tactics, they were able to reduce the number who caught the disease, but who actually died. There was a fraction, in fact, of in terms of percentages of the numbers in various other countries. And it's the rate of growth was up to 5% a few months ago. So there's no question of the situation of China and its importance. Today, a leading firm, BlackRock, which I think has something like 7 trillion in shares, it's specializes in buying and selling of shares, but of course plays a crucial role. BlackRock does, that is, together with Vanguard and State Street, two similar companies which are considerably smaller. Anyway, the point is that they are investing in China. They're directly investing in China. There's considerable American investment going into China. And I'm not clear what the aim of the Chinese leadership is. They still call their party the Communist Party, and where they're actually going. However, there's no question of its development, and in areas of its actual development, they can be ahead of the rest of the world. So the United States is effectively cooperating with them in industrial terms, and we're seeing that relatively, well, the very fast development of China, although it has slowed down compared to the earlier period. And the United States has effectively taken the line that it is going to invest in it in that way. Trump had taken what amounts to a very hostile line up to now. Up to now, as far as I can see, the United States hasn't brought to an end the various measures introduced by Trump, but it does appear to be less hostile. They did have a meeting in Alaska, which went a wrong way from their point of view, presumably. Both sides wanted to come to a deal. It looks as if they weren't able to. However, I'm not at all certain what that really means. I'm not at all clear what the United States actually would think could happen. It doesn't seem to me that the original intention of the probably the Bush administration to allow China to develop under its control and do to it, or at least partly do to it, what they did to Russia after it overthrew Stalinism. In relation to Russia, what they did was refuse to accept big firms having an international role. You simply didn't have it. They didn't allow it. They didn't want it. Didn't want the competition. And it's clear that what the United States expected, what China would develop to a point where they could harness it, as it were, under its own aegis, that the Chinese are not going to accept. And that fight is going to continue. Of course, from the point of view of the left, you can take neither side. You have to stand with working class in each side. But the interaction between the two countries is bound to continue. Though a more sensible United States would simply pull out of that kind of line. I don't know whether they're afraid that China would take over the world, which is highly unlikely, or simply they want to establish American investment and control in China. But that appears to be the kind of fight which is now going on. Obviously, the Chinese government has as much to do with socialism as my dog. So we're not talking about social development, even though we actually have a few people from far left groups who adopted China as a world, gone there to work. In terms of the rest of the world, it appears to me the situation for the third world is dire, absolutely dire, with the exception of a number of countries in Asia or East Asia. The position in South Africa is precisely that, but it's true throughout Africa, even worse than in South Africa. Standard of living is low. The development of industry hardly exists or has gone backwards. Or at most has stagnated. Clearly, a globalist United States, which is what the United States is, has to consider what they are going to do with Africa in particular, and parts of South America. Europe, in its turn, seems to me to be utterly muddled. The section of Europe which came from the former Soviet Union really doesn't know where to go. They were clearly expecting a rise in standard of the population, or the leaders, or both, were expecting a rise in the population to the same level as, say, France or Britain. The standard of living has risen up to a point. It's limited. And a lot of the industry which was there, if you just look, say, East Germany as an example, and East Germany got completely wiped out. That's to say, effectively, these countries they're not colonies, but semi-colonies, or whatever term you want to regard them as, within the EU itself. The United States remains not just the dominant power, but the dominant economic power. It is globalist in the sense of running it, not just politically, but financially. It is the financial hegemon, without question. And it continues in that form. What Biden has recognized is that there has to be a form of change, something which is less dominant, less obviously exploitative, something which in the United States itself does provide for the population as a whole. If that is maintained, if it is successful, logically it would have to extend to the rest of the world. Otherwise, it's highly unlikely to maintain itself otherwise. So what's happening in the United States is crucial. I don't think there's any doubt. It doesn't mean that the left are in power. They are definitely not in power. And the left is relatively small. But there clearly is a change, which you have to ask, why is there this at all? Well, we have to go back to first principles, as it were. In 1917, the revolution did overthrow capitalism, and it did bring the world into a state of transition. That is where we are. It isn't just a question of a particular country raising the red flag. It is also the changing nature of necessary changing nature of economies under these conditions of being in a transition period. It's necessarily true that finance is itself unproductive. It is true that the society has to develop industry in order that the standard of living rise. If it simply shifts to finance capital, it's doing almost nothing. It is parasitic. One can go into the details of the nature of the transitional period, the forms which have come into existence, and which in fact, to considerable degrees, play an important role in the economy and in the society. Thank you.